Hello. This is the first in a series of presentations that relate to the notion of mental models. And before we talk about the concept of mental models itself, I wanted to make sure that everyone had a really good understanding of a couple of frameworks that help us to explain behaviour in real-world settings. So what this lecture is going to do is just take you through a couple of theories that are really helpful when it comes to us understanding the way that we interact with products and systems in the real world. And I tend to use these theories in a couple of ways. I think first of all, they tend to help me work out where we might need to make an intervention in terms of a design of some sort. But also, as with many of the concepts that I talk about in these lectures, they're quite resonant notions, they're quite memorable notions. And remember that I've said one of the points of being an ergonomist is persuading other people within an overall design process that taking account of people's capabilities and limitations is really important. So using these frameworks for explanation can be very helpful in terms of ensuring that we get human factors embedded and integrated in design. So the first type of theory I want to talk to you about is something you may have come across before. If you've done psychology before, you will have come across the distinction between skill, rule, and knowledge-based behaviour. This is a theory that has been proposed by Jens Rasmussen, but adopted by many others, and forms quite an underpinning of our explanations of the way that we behave in a real-world setting. It's also related to things that we see in theories around working memory, and is something we call upon when we're thinking about factors such as allocation of function and fits list, for example, that I talked about in the consolidation lectures for theme 1. So what are the differences between skill, rule and knowledge-based behaviour? Well, I suppose the sort of existence of these three types of behaviours is one of the things that really distinguishes people from computers. We don't necessarily know whether we're executing skill, rule and knowledge-based behaviour. We seamlessly glide between these different types of behaviour, often executing multiple types of behaviour at the same time. Skill-based behaviour is really closely related to procedural memory. If you remember, we talked about procedural memory as part of long-term memory. And it's normally sensory motor performance. So sensory means we're taking information from the environment through one of our senses. Motor means that we're usually physically executing a task in some way. It might be through the motion of our whole body. It might be through interaction with a system somehow. So it's sensory motor performance, which takes place as more or less automatic behaviour after a statement of intention. So there's a couple of really important things here. The first is this notion of a statement of intention. Just because a behaviour is a skill-based behaviour doesn't mean we omit that process of deciding to act. Remember that human information processing model that we've gone over a couple of times now, with attention at the top, and we've got stimulus and response, and we move through working memory, thought, decision making, action selection, execution of action. All of that still happens with skill-based behaviour. But the execution of the behaviour can be more or less automatic. And what more or less automatic means is it commands very little, if any, of our attentional resources. So we're able to execute the behaviour without consciously attending to the way that we are executing that behaviour. And we execute skill-based behaviour all the time. So we execute skill-based behaviour when we're walking. We're not born knowing how to walk. We learn, we either teach ourselves or sort of are taught a little bit how to walk when we're very young. We learn how to feed ourselves using cutlery. We learn how to open door handles. We learn how to do all sorts of physical tasks, and then sometimes we explicitly learn things, we choose to learn things like riding a bicycle, and once we've learned them, we're able to execute them as automatic skill-based behaviour. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever tried to teach someone to ride a bicycle. Riding a bicycle is a really difficult thing to teach someone. I know that when I taught my children to ride a bicycle, actually what I did was I looked at YouTube videos about what to do. And the interesting thing is that YouTube videos tell you to focus on different elements of the task, such as, for example, gliding along the bicycle, either using a sort of balance bike or with your feet off the pedals. They tell you to teach your child to focus on steering. So they're not necessarily being taught to organise the different ways in which we're distributing our weight, which is actually the way we manage to balance on a bicycle, because that's a really complicated thing for anyone to understand, let alone a, I don't know, 4, 5, 6-year-old who's learning to ride a bicycle. But what you can focus on is the movement of the handlebars on a bike and being able to use those and manipulate that in order to maintain the balance of the bike, for example. One of the things that often is a good indicator that a behaviour is skill-based is if it's really difficult to explain to someone else how to do it. And the reason it's very difficult for me to explain how to ride a bicycle to my children is because I haven't consciously attended to how to ride a bicycle for 40 years or so. And so it's been automatic behaviour for all of that time since I learned to ride a bicycle, and I'm therefore really, really unable to articulate or describe what I'm doing when I'm riding a bicycle. And we do see these tasks in other aspects of our life as well. So remember, a really good indicator of whether a behaviour is skill-based is if it's really, really difficult to explain. Rule-based behaviours are the sorts of things we see computers do seamlessly all the time. Humans are okay at rule-based behaviours, but rule-based behaviours are really subject to interference from distraction, from fatigue, from boredom, and things like this. And of course, computers don't get tired or bored. So rule-based behaviour describes goal-oriented performance. So remember in that onion model I showed you in the introduction lecture, we had tasks and we had goals. So one of the things that distinguishes human behaviour is that we often have a goal, a purpose, an objective we wish to achieve, and that might be different from the task we're actually executing. So it's goal-oriented performance, controlled by a stored rule or procedure. So we have learned the rule or procedure somehow, and it might have been derived from past experience, or it might have been learned from other people's experience. So an example of when we act upon a rule is interpreting and acting on familiar road signs. So if I see a road sign in the UK that says 30, and we use miles per hour in the UK, then I know that I must drive no more than 30 miles per hour. So I'm executing the response to that rule. Knowledge-based behaviour is one of the things that humans are brilliant at. Remember, humans are fallible, humans are brilliant. Our job is to minimise the impact of human fallibility and maximise the value of human brilliance. Knowledge-based behaviour is goal-controlled or model-based behaviour, and we use it in unfamiliar situations. We develop a plan using our knowledge, our past experience in some way. Reasoning, remember that humans are still good at inductive reasoning. And experience to predict the outcome of actions. So we try and think, this is a bit like situation awareness, isn't it? So we try and think, right, what's going to happen if I do this? What will be the future state of the environment if I do this? How will that affect things? And is that therefore the right thing to do? We'll talk a lot about knowledge-based behaviour when we talk about decision making in a couple of lectures' time as well. So a situation when you might use knowledge-based behaviour is navigating in an unfamiliar environment. You might use logic, you might look at the space that you're in and think, well, is this a lecture room or is it an office? And you don't need explicit labels that say lecture room, office. You know from your past experience what a typical office might look like, what a typical lecture room might look like, and you use that to understand where you are. So what this slide takes us through is these three types of behaviour: skill, rule and knowledge-based behaviour. In the consolidation session, I'll take you through a bit of an exercise to try and think about what types of behaviour we find in different situations. So maybe spend a bit of time between now and when you come along to the consolidation lecture to just think about whether behaviours that you're executing yourselves are skill-based behaviours, rule-based behaviours, or knowledge-based behaviours. So this is an example, again, of a rule-based behaviour. This is a pick and place task. So a typical pick and place task is where we pick up an object and we put it in the required location. You can see an example of a human-based pick and place task in the bottom left there, a supermarket shelf stacking task. So placing the items for sale in the right place on the supermarket shelves is a classic pick and place task. We see these a lot within a manufacturing environment where you might have a sort of a Kanban layout of different components, and your job is to pick the right item for that particular point in the manufacturing task. You can see in the top right of this slide that we've got a robot controlled environment. And remember, one of the things I said is that actually technology can be very, very good at rule-based behaviour. So in this particular example, we've got a pick and place task where the robot is able to distinguish between the colour of the items in front of it and move them into the appropriate locations. This is an example of a knowledge-based task. This is a somewhere that oddly I'm very familiar with. I don't do that much travel, but it does seem that whenever I do travel, I seem to go via Pisa Airport. And I've had a couple of reasonably sort of hairy experiences where I've had flights delayed or even flights diverted, and then I've ended up back at Pisa by a coach trip or something like this. And so I've a couple of times been there on my own, and I've needed to work out how to get from Pisa Airport in Italy to the centre of Pisa. And that's where the centre of Pisa, there's a train station, and I need to change at the train station in order to go to my onward destination. So I've actually never been to Pisa, the town, never seen the Leaning Tower of Pisa, but I've been to the airport and the train station a few times. So I was there one particular morning. I'd had very little sleep because my flight had been diverted, and I'd actually spent all night either up at an airport or on a coach trip back to Pisa again. And I had to understand which stop I needed to disembark at. So which stop did I need to leave the, this is a metro system that takes you from the airport to the required train station. And all I'd been told was I have to go to the railway station. That's all I knew. So I was faced with this, and interestingly, the first time I went to Pisa, the little metro sort of tram system had only opened 2 days before. So there were no staff around, no one, even the locals hadn't been on the transit system before. So how did I know where I was and where I needed to go? Well, and I don't speak any Italian, by the way, at all. So what did I get from this sign? Well, first of all, there's a word there, stazione, with a sincere apologies to anyone who speaks Italian and my pronunciation. So we've got Stazione Aeroporto and Stazione San Giusto Aurelia, gosh, I am sorry, and Stazione FS Pizza Centro. Okay, where am I, first of all? Right, how do I know where I am? There's no "you are here" sign or anything like this, but there is a little indicator there. There's one of the dots is red and the other two are grey. So I'm taking from my experience of other types of systems that I'm probably at the place with the red dot. And there's another little clue there for me, which is that the text for Stazione Aeroporto is in bold text, and the other two are sort of slightly greyed out text. So that's where I am. So where do I need to go? All I know is I need to go to the railway station. Well, there's two things here. Stazione San Giusto Aurelia and Stazione FS Pisa Centro. Right, where's the train station? Well, I know that normally, particularly in Italy, and I've been to Italy a few times on holiday and things, the train station does tend to be quite near the centre of a town. But I also know that there are really often train stations that are named after saints or other sort of famous figures. This seems to be something that is quite often the case in European settings. So the question then is, do I get off at Stazione San Giusto Aurelia or Stazione FS Pizza Centro? Pisa Centro. Right, I've just noticed a problem. There's two that are called Stazione. In fact, they're all called Stazione. So how do I know which one's the train station? Right, I actually didn't panic too much here. I was pretty sure that where I needed to go was Pisa Centro. But the other thing I did when I was on the metro, and it was very early in the morning and there weren't many people there, I looked out the window. Unfortunately, it was light. And when I got to Stazione San Giusto Aurelia, it sort of looked like it was an industrial park or a car park or something like this. And no one else on the tram who had suitcases with them got off the tram. So by this point, I was pretty confident that actually the place, and it was correct, that I needed to disembark from the tram was Stazione FS Pizza. Let me stop saying pizza. Pisa Centro. So I used my knowledge-based behaviour here. And that's actually quite a typical type of situation in which you use knowledge-based behaviour when you're encountering a new situation. And the point is that I was continually updating my decision-making, my understanding of the situation. I was observing other people. I was looking out of the train. And I was just keeping an eye on the information. I was also listening to announcements because sometimes the announcements might be in different languages as well. So the next thing I want to talk about is a really nice little notion that I think I've mentioned in some of the previous presentations as well, actually, which is the notion of knowledge in the head and knowledge in the world. If any of you have read the Psychology of Everyday Things book by Donald Norman, he talks about this theory in there. And his point is, not all knowledge required for precise behaviour has to be in the head. Now, if you remember, when we did the long-term memory exercise in the lecture consolidation, I asked you to draw a picture of a coin or to, I think, write down the apps on your phone or write down the time when your favourite place opened. And the point of that was none of us were very good at that task, really, but that's okay. We still managed to get to the restaurant on time. We still managed to pay with the right amount of money. We still managed to use our phones. And that's because the information that we need in order to complete the task is distributed between our heads and in the world. And that's brilliant. That's really helpful. It's really efficient. It means we're not having to go through a massive training experience every time we do anything new, because the knowledge in the world helps us through that particular scenario. We also have something called constraints, and I'll talk about constraints a little bit more in some of the later sessions as well. Constraints stop us doing things. They can be physical constraints, so they might stop us opening a door from the bottom upwards. The handle that's there is a cue, and the constraint with the hinges means that I can only open the door using the hinges on the right-hand side of the door. We also have cultural constraints. So there are certain behaviours that we expect in certain situations and others that would be really odd. So I have the cultural expectation of the door that it will open and I won't need to burst through it in order to get through the door, because I know that in our culture we have doors and we open them, we don't bash our way through them. So that's a cultural constraint that's present. So what Donald Norman argues is that one of the brilliant things about people is how we seamlessly work in partnership with knowledge in the world. We have knowledge in our head and we work with knowledge in the world. And we still manage to execute very precise behaviour. And this is because so much information is in the world. Often we don't need great precision. So I might open the door with a different level of force than my children might open the door, but we all manage to open the door because it doesn't need to be the precise torque, the precise amount of force that we need to execute in order to complete the task. So we very often do tasks that don't require great precision because of the constraints around us and because of the tolerances within the engineered systems that we work with as well. So we have these natural constraints present and these cultural constraints as well. So Donald Norman quite helpfully distinguished between a number of properties of knowledge in the world and knowledge in the head. The first thing he thought about was retrievability. Knowledge in the world is retrievable whenever it's visible or audible. Now let's think right back to 3 Mile Island. One of the things I hope you sort of gleaned in 3 Mile Island was that the control environment didn't really provide a fantastic amount of knowledge in the world. There were cues that were visible, there were cues that were audible, there were too many alarms going off, you couldn't distinguish between them. But actually, having that knowledge in the world in a helpful context and a helpful organisation was not something that actually was present, and therefore the operators took a long time in order to diagnose all of the problems with the nuclear plant they were controlling at the time. But they also didn't have knowledge in the head because they hadn't foreseen this particular scenario. So knowledge in the head sometimes is not readily retrievable, but that very much depends on our expertise. It often requires memory search or reminding. But if we're dealing with a familiar situation, knowledge in the head can be much more readily retrievable than if it's an unfamiliar situation. If I'm dealing with a really quite complex task, I might have to think through a number of different scenarios or search through my memory or even go away and think about something for a few days before I actually get the information from my head as I really need. Knowledge in the world does not require learning. Interpretation substitutes for learning. But knowledge in the head does require learning, and we know, and again, this makes sense from our understanding of the episodic and semantic nature of memory that we've already talked about. It can be easier to learn things if there is meaning or structure to the material that we're presented with. Knowledge in the world can be inefficient to use. If we have to search through, find and interpret external information, then knowledge in the world can be really cumbersome and can delay us in completion of tasks. And knowledge in the head can be very efficient. But if we're dealing with a task which is really, really well designed, and an example I might say is buying a train ticket at the railway station. Those sorts of tasks are very well designed. There are often cues that take you through the different stages of the task. We already bring a mental model of what we're expecting to the task, and I'll talk about mental models in a bit. We tend to have very small amounts of information that's presented to us in that type of task as well. But in general, if we need knowledge in the world, it tends to be something that slows up the process. And if we can do a task purely with knowledge in the head, that can be the most efficient way of executing the task. However, knowledge in the world does tend to be easy to use for a first encounter, which is why something like a ticket machine, it's really appropriate to have knowledge in the world, because we don't want to have to learn how to use a ticket machine or rely on our memory. We just want to deal with the situation there and then forget about it. Knowledge in the head requires that development of expertise. From an aesthetic and appearance point of view, knowledge in the world can be unaesthetic and inelegant and can lead to clutter. And of course, that's where some of the skills of design can be. Whereas knowledge in the head, nothing needs to be designed or presented, which can lead to more positive aesthetics. But remember that first point about retrievability. Sometimes we might want there to be a cue in the world that reminds us how we can access information from our head. So I'm just going to take you through a little example here. This is a really nice example. You'll by now probably have submitted your slide on the Moodle of an example piece of design, and I'm just going to show you an example from a previous year's student, which gives an explanation of sometimes how we can have quite a lot of challenges with knowledge in the head and knowledge in the world. It's quite a detailed example, but it's a really nice one actually, because it's got quite a lot of nuances in it. So I'm really grateful to the student who submitted this in a previous year. This is a temporary bus stop. So what we've got in the top left here is some information about the design of the bus stop. And let me see if I can show it to you. So the student's arguing this is a bad design of the bus stop. And they're pointing out a couple of things here. So first of all, there's some things that are quite good in terms of knowledge in the world. So we've got a picture of the bus. Brilliant, that's good. It's not relying on language need. We can recognise that that's an image of the bus. And then there's also the word bus stop as well. So we understand that this is a bus stop. It also explains it's a temporary stop, and that's put there at the top. And it explains the bus company, Megabus and Sinbad. You would need a little bit of knowledge in the head to know that Megabus and particularly Sinbad are actually names of bus companies or bus services. I've heard of Megabus. I actually haven't heard of Sinbad, so I don't have that knowledge in my head, but I would infer from the fact we've got this knowledge in the world that probably Sinbad is something to do with buses, and it's in the same font and just underneath Megabus. So I'd think it's either a bus service. I might think it's the name of the bus stop, because sometimes bus stops are given names like Grove Road or High Road or something like that. So I suppose I might think it was the name of the bus stop. But Sinbad is a bit of a strange name, so I'd be a bit surprised if that was the name of the bus stop. Then at the bottom it says stop in use from Monday 10th of July. So the student, and I think the students explained it really nicely here. So the student explained what happened. So as a passenger, number 3 on the picture caught their eyes immediately, and this is how they interpreted it. Stop, verb. So stop is a word in the English language, one of the many words we have that are very unhelpful. So it can be a noun or a verb. So a noun is obviously describing it as a bus stop, and verb means to stop, so stop doing that, right? So stop, the verb, in use from Monday the 10th of July. And the way that the information is attached, and it looks new, which is interesting, and yeah, I can see that. It doesn't look dirty or anything like that. It looks like quite a new item. Now I set the coursework in September, October time, so I guess it had been there for a few months by this point. On the board made me confirm that the bus stop had stopped using recently. So the bus stop had previously been used, but since the 10th of July had not been being used. So therefore the student thought, right, well I need to find the right bus stop because this one isn't being used anymore. And did the right thing. One of the things we often do with knowledge-based behaviour is ask around, and no one knew where the new stop was. Fortunately, a kind postman helped the student to ask in the hotel nearby. And the staff came out and said, well, no, this is the correct stop. And actually, it means stop, noun, in use from Monday the 10th of July. So the interesting thing is that the student interpreted the language wrong. And by asking around, other people had interpreted it wrong as well. So I presume the student wasn't a native English speaker, but they said that others who were native English speakers had the same opinion. And then they've made a really helpful design suggestion, which is start using from Monday the 10th of July. So really interesting here. What we've got here is knowledge in the world, but the student also used their knowledge in the head. And in this case, the combination of the two led to a bit of confusion from the student. But there was knowledge in the world, and if you look, we've got temporary stop, stop as a noun. Bus stop, stop as a noun. The word stop here, do we know if it's a noun or a verb? We don't know. And the student made a guess and it was the wrong guess. The next theory I just want to talk you through, and this is the last one in this presentation, is something that Donald Norman puts together. I think I find this useful. I don't find myself referring back to this very often. I do talk about knowledge in the head and the world a lot. I do talk about skill rule and knowledge-based behaviour. I think maybe this is a bit complicated. There are other theories that maybe explain this a bit more easily. We'll talk about them in the final theme, actually, where we talk about things like sense making. But nevertheless, Norman put together something he called 7 stages of action. 7 stages of action really are Donald Norman's way of breaking down what he feels happens when we perceive the state of the world and act in response to the state of the world. So he says we start and we perceive the state of the world, interpret that perception, evaluate our interpretations on the basis of that, form some goals. We then form an intention to act, develop a sequence of actions, and execute the action sequence. Now, as I say, I personally think there are probably better or more easy to understand theories that explain this cyclical process of updating our understanding of the world, making our decisions. However, there are 2 quite neat concepts that Donald Norman highlights, which are to do with when things go slightly wrong within the 7 stages of action. So the first notion that Donald Norman talks about is something called the gulf of execution. The gulf of execution occurs when I formed a goal, but when I look at the interface or the system I'm interacting with, I can't see how I can interact with the system in order to execute the action that I have expressed a desire to execute. The action I've expressed a desire to execute in this example is I want to record a group meeting. I've just met with all of my second year tutees and it's really important I make a note of who's been at that meeting and what we discussed. Now, if I look on the screen in front of me, I can't see anything about recording a group meeting. I can see something here that says one-to-one meetings, but where's group meetings? Module marks, year results, lab details? There's nothing there about group meetings. What the situation was here was I had an inappropriate mental model, an inappropriate understanding of how the system worked. I wasn't getting enough knowledge from the world to help me execute the particular task I wanted to. I was in an unfamiliar situation, so I was using my knowledge-based behaviour. Actually, the solution would have been to go here to my groups, and I hadn't quite realised, but my groups would give me a different representation and it would enable me then to record a meeting. I'm in the my students mode at the moment. I didn't realise that because there's no knowledge in the world telling me that my students is currently the active mode that we're working in. The second notion that Donald Norman explains is the gulf of evaluation. The gulf of evaluation refers to another gap between knowledge in the world and knowledge in the head. In this case, we've known what action we want to execute, we've made the decision, we believe we've executed the action, but we haven't got any feedback. And that feedback is what we get from the world that helps us decide on our next action. This is the same system, here, this system, I'm interested, I've managed to send an email to my tutees, and I've got some instructions here. Select the groups containing the students that you wish to email by clicking on the relevant item on the list. And I then need to check the names of the students that I want to send an email to, and complete the subject and the message in the panel to the right and hit send. And I kept accidentally sending loads of emails to my students. I kept sending an email 3 or 4 times and I couldn't work out why. And it's because I failed to address the gulf of execution. This system and me working together didn't quite align, and so there was a gulf of execution in my understanding. And the reason was because my expectation was that when I sent a message, the message would disappear from the screen. If we think about most common email systems, when you send a message, let's say I send one on my iPhone, it makes a little whoosh type noise when the email goes as well. So I've got a couple of extra cues. Didn't have any cue, or I thought I didn't have any cue. Don't know if you can see, there was some information. Just at the bottom here, we've got some green text that says email has been sent. That is the cue that completes the gulf of execution, of evaluation. But I wasn't looking for that, didn't spot it, so it didn't have good attentional properties to draw its attention to me. And actually, I didn't realise it was feedback. It's the way it's designed is it's in a sort of box. It almost looks like I've typed the information in myself. So it didn't come across as information that was telling me that there had been a change to the system state in some way. So this is just one example of a gulf of evaluation. So that's the end of this short presentation. What I recommend you do is just over the next few days, just think about your own behaviours. Think about whether you're executing